Okay, so now we've seen the first hook use state. So I want to move on to the next hook, and that one is called UseEffect. So in this lesson, we're going to learn the UseEffect hook. So first of all, import that up here, UseEffect, like so. Now all hook functions generally use this naming convention, use something, right? So you can think of this UseEffect hook a little bit like a lifecycle method that we would normally use inside of a class component in React. So when we use functional components, we don't have access to those lifecycle methods. And if we wanted to run some code when the component updates, we'd normally need to use a class component. But now we can use this UseEffect hook instead in a functional component. So why don't we just use it down here? UseEffect is a function. And again, it will take in here a callback function as parameter. And that callback function is going to run every time the component renders or re-renders. So every time the data inside our component changes, it will also change the initial render. So you could use this UseEffect hook to do something like communicate with a database or an API endpoint or something like that. So let's see how it works. All I'm going to do is log something into the console. So I'm just going to say console.log, and I want to say UseEffect. And then I want to output the to-dos. So let's save this and flip on back to the browser. So when the page first loads and it first renders, we should see this function fire in here. And then every time the data here changes inside the component, then the component will re-render. And on that re-render, this function is going to fire again. So every time the component renders, this UseEffect hook will be called. So if I add a new to-do, then we should see it again, like so. Now we see the UseEffect hook run again, this time with the extra data. Let's just type in some random stuff there again, and we can see the UseEffect hook run again. Perfect. So this UseEffect is running every time the component renders, or every time the data updates inside the component, and when it first renders as well. Okay, so now I want to demonstrate another use case of UseEffect hook. So let's imagine that we had lots of different data inside this component. So anytime any of that data is updated, then this hook is going to run. So let's demonstrate. For instance, let's create some more states by using the useState hook. I'll say const, and this will be count and set count. And we will set that equal to useState, and we can use the useState hook or other hooks as many times as we want to inside a component, in fact. Right now, we're just storing different values, like this one to do state, and this one is count. So I'm going to give it 0 as its initial value. Then I'm going to create a button, and when we click on that button, it's going to increase the count by 1. So let's do that at the bottom down here. And I'll do a button in here. Now inside this button, I'll just say score, semicolon, and open up a set of curly braces, then count. And we will print count as the score on the browser. So to begin with, this will be 0. But as we click on this, we want it to start adding 1 by 1 and again. So let's add the onClick event handler. And inside of here, we'll just do an inline arrow function, and we want to call setCount. And we'll take the current count and add 1 to it. So basically, the new value is going to be whatever the current count is plus 1. And that should then update the state. And therefore, we'll trigger a re-render. And therefore, this should run as well. Okay, so let's save all this and preview it in the browser. So we can see it's currently 0. Add 1 to count. Score goes to 1. And you see the UseEffect hook run. Now I'll do it again, and it comes up again. So this data is not changing the to-dos, but all right, that doesn't matter right now. Some data inside the component is changing. Therefore, it re-renders the component. When the component re-renders, it's running that UseEffect hook. But now, I'll show you, though, in this case, we might not want to run this callback function every time that any data is updated. For example, we only wanted to run this function when this data changed and not this data. So how do we do that? I'll show you. If we come over here, we can see that it still runs when we add some data because it's running after any kind of data change. But what if all we want to do is fire it only when we change the to-dos data, not this one? So we can do that by passing a second parameter into the UseEffect hook. And that second parameter is going to be an array of data that we essentially want to watch. So we only want to run this UseEffect function when the data inside this array changes. So for example, I could pass in here to-dos like so. That means we only want to run this callback function in the UseEffect hook run when the to-dos data changes, not when the count data changes. So if I save this and come over here and add 1 to the count, then it's still increasing the count. The data is changing and the component is re-rendering, but this is not running all the time. We only get it on the initial render. So if I start to add a to-do, then we get that callback function. So that's great. We're now limiting this function when we use this callback function. So as I mentioned before, we can use a UseEffect hook as many times as we want inside the component, just like a useState hook. So let me just copy this and paste it down here. And again, I'm just going to change this one to count and change this one to count as well. So that means only run this callback function when count is changed. So in here, instead of to-dos, we will output the count right here. So let's save all this and come back over here. All right, so first of all, we will see 2 callback functions have run, one for the to-dos and one for the count, because they will both run on an initial render. Now, if we add a new to-do, then we get this one for the to-dos, but we don't get the other. If I start adding 1 to count, then we get the other hook function running, right? So that's making a lot more sense, and that's how to use this UseEffect hook. Now we are using the UseEffect to run some code every time the data changes, or whenever the component renders. And this is how we limit it to only run based on certain data. Okay? So that's the basics of hooks covered. In the next lesson, I would like to move on to using hooks alongside context. So review any of that if you need to, and we'll take a break here, and we'll come back in the next lesson. I look forward to seeing you then.